Following the initial hardships in the immediate post-World War I era, the United States had one of the most prosperous decades in its history. Typically, this decade has been referred to as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, and that will be the topic of today's lecture. The lecture will be divided into 4 parts, and the first part of the lecture will look at prosperity, leisure, and entertainment during this period, all of which characterized the Roaring Twenties. One of the first dimensions that really was unique and classified and characterized the Roaring Twenties were movies. And really the reason that movies took off during this period is because the prosperity that people had created more disposable income to spend on entertainment. And moving pictures and movie palaces, which sat 1,000 people, really grew to be very, very popular during this period. People attended them from very far away and far more regularly than people do today. In fact, most people attended the cinema at least once a week. And by the end of the decade, by 1929, there were about 90 million weekly movie attendees. Silent movies during the period were really the roar, and they gave rise to a lot of movie stars, including Rudolph Valentino, Clara Bow from the It Girl, and the most popular silent movie star was naturally Charlie Chaplin. Now, in 1927, there was the first talkie, namely the first movie that wasn't silent, that had voice actors, an audible sound, and this was known as the Jazz Singer, which starred Al Jolson, and it basically followed the life of a Jewish man from boyhood in a synagogue to life as a famous Americanized jazz singer, so really typified the American dream. Now, originally, most movies were shot in New York, but during the 1920s, during the Roaring Twenties, flocks of movie stars and directors, including D.W. Griffith and others, went to California to avoid the high taxes and the high problems that resulted from the patents that Thomas Edison had on the cinema in the 1910s and in the early part of the 20th century. And in the 1920s, California and Hollywood really became the home of the industry. Now, one of the most significant innovations of this period was the automobile. And really this defined the period, as did movies, because for the first time in the history of the automobile, the general public now had access to it. Now, in the early 20th century, cars were really too expensive for most people. However, a man by the name of Henry Ford developed the Ford Model T, and he used mass production to manufacture automobiles, and also used the perfect assembly line in which one individual would have one specific task to allow labor costs to be decreased and make car production more cost efficient. As a result, this eventually lowered the price of the Model T from $850 in 1908 to $300 in 1924. And in fact, some people were actually able to buy Model Ts during the 1920s for as little as $5 if they were used. So it really did become something that was accessible even to the poor during this period, and transformed America as a result. Now, by 1929, there were 23 million automobiles on the road. Now, naturally, mass production, as we've talked about in the previous lectures, had both benefits and disadvantages or drawbacks to workers. And Ford, in particular, did not allow unions. Now, the boring nature of the work also led to a high turnover rate. However, Ford doubled workers' pay during this period from $5 to $5 a day, And he also had 8-hour working days, which were appealing to a lot of workers and attracted them to Ford's plants. Another significant thing that Ford did during this period was that he paid white and black workers equally, and many African Americans actually moved to Detroit and other cities during this period to work for Ford and other car manufacturers. Now, the automobile really changed America, both economically and socially, and that aspect cannot be underestimated. Industries like glass and steel and rubber increased to meet the automobile demands and the demands for the interiors and the exteriors of these machines. The oil industry in California, Oklahoma, and Texas expanded to basically allow for so many cars to be on the streets. And there was also a new need for public roadways that permitted motels and restaurants to spring up, and really created a brand new infrastructure in America, and new shopping and living patterns emerged in the United States as a result of the automobile. So it really cannot be stated enough how the automobile changed American society during the 1920s. Here is a advertisement for the Ford Model T. And that brings us to air travel, which was another significant innovation during this period. Now, men and women, including the African-American stunt pilot Bessie Coleman, had flown for nearly 2 decades prior to the 1920s. However, in the early 1900s, there was still a lot of doubt about how practical planes were for long-distance travel. In fact, Orville Wright, who is accredited with being one of the first men to fly, said that no flying machine will ever fly from New York to Paris because no known motor can run at the requisite speed for 4 days without stopping. However, in 1927, a man by the name of Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And he actually flew from New York to Paris in 33 hours. After this, opinions in the United States completely changed, and the flight actually made Lindbergh a celebrity and the best known American in the whole world. He was greeted with parades, and from that point forward, the airline industry began to blossom. Now, in the 1930s, which is beyond the scope of this lecture, it really came to fruition with companies like Boeing, which developed the passenger aircraft, and it also became more and more popular with engine and passenger compartment improvements. And by 1939, there were about 2 million people that flew annually. Now, another significant innovation which also transformed the American landscape was the radio. And after their introduction in the First World War, radios became common in homes in the 1920s. During the 1920s, hundreds of radio stations popped up. They broadcasted news, serial stories, political speeches, and they also had advertising which was interspersed, which really created a popular culture in that respect as well. Now, radio was better than magazines or newspapers because it really gave more direct access to customers for advertising agencies and for companies, and that really transformed the business landscape as well. Now, another significant thing about radios is it also sped up the process of nationalization and homogenization in the United States, which began with telegraphs and newspapers in the previous decades. Now, programs could be heard throughout the country, and that's really what sped up this process of homogenization. There were syndicated shows throughout the country, such as Amos and Andy in the late 1920s, which entertained people with racial stereotypes about African Americans. And Americans from coast to coast really had the same programming, so there wasn't this sort of isolated dimension which existed in previous decades. And this really smoothed out regional differences both in terms of dialect and language, and it really created a centralized and homogenized music and consumer taste during this period. Moreover, it also really transformed sports, which really been a regional or local thing in the previous decades. Now play-by-play descriptions of events were available, and it brought sports to homes across the country. It also popularized sports figures, including men like Jim Thorpe, who was a Native American and was one of the best known athletes in the world during this period. Jim Thorpe, for those of you that aren't familiar, medaled in the 1912 Olympics, and he played in Major League Baseball, and he was also a founding member of the NFL. There were also a number of famous women that came to prominence during this period because of the radio, including Gertrude Elderly, who swam the English Channel, Helen Willis, who won Wimbledon 8 times during the 1920s. However, the biggest star, which was really brought to the forefront because of the radio, was the Sultan of SWAT himself, Babe Ruth, who became America's first baseball hero. And the significant thing about Babe Ruth was that he really changed the game from a very low-scoring, pitcher-dominated event to one where hitting became famous. And in 1924, at the height of the Roaring Twenties, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. Here's a picture of both Babe Ruth and Helen Willis, who, as I mentioned before, won Wimbledon 8 times during the 1920s. And that brings us to the second part of the lecture, namely backlash against the New World, the Roaring Twenties, and the Jazz era. Now, one of the significant backlashes which really emerged during this period was that many rural areas, and in particular many white Anglo-Saxon Americans, disagreed with the leisure and consumption and popular culture that had evolved during this era. And they reacted to all of this with defense of religious values and the rejection of cultural diversity and equality. One of the examples of this is what was known as nativism. And this was really characterized by a strong fear of immigrants, extremists, and communists during this period. Now, it was really Southern and Eastern European immigrants that triggered the anxiety and racial animosity which existed during this period. And the reason for this was that they were perceived as a foreign threat, mainly because several anarchist groups had assassinated many prominent individuals during this period, including the Spanish Prime Minister, who was assassinated in 1897, the Italian king, who was assassinated in the year 1900, and as we talked about in a previous lecture, President William McKinley of the United States, who was assassinated in 1901. Now, following the Bolshevik Revolution during the First World War, there was a sense of an immediate or an inevitable foreign or communist threat, and this really came to a head. This fear of immigrants and the fear of the things and the ideas the immigrants were bringing came to a head with the trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vinzetti in the year 1920. Now, both Italian immigrants had been accused of being part of a bank robbery and murder in Braintree, Massachusetts. Now, ultimately, there was no direct evidence of their involvement, but both men were known anarchists who favored the destruction of the American market-based economy and capitalistic society through violence. So they were basically targeted because of that. And the district attorney that prosecuted the case really emphasized their views which, in spite of the lack of evidence, really was what did them in. And they were found guilty in July of 1921 and were ultimately executed 6 years later in August of 1927, despite a number of motions and appeals based on ballistic testing and recanted testimony on behalf of several witnesses in the case, and also an ex-convict's confession that he had actually done the bank robbery and committed murders. Now, the verdict ultimately sparked protests in the United States from Italians and other immigrants, and also a number of celebrities, including writer John Dos Passos, satirist Dorothy Parker, and even physicist Albert Einstein. However, people like President Coolidge, who was president at the time, really pushed through this fear of immigrants and extremists, who eventually ended up signing a number of anti-immigrant bills and declared that America must be kept American. Now here's a picture of Sacco and Vanzetti, and also the worldwide protests against their execution. You can see this one is in England, and it states that a protest or a demonstration will be held in Trafalgar Square. Now, another aspect that really emerged during this period as a result of the immigration was racism. And essentially there was a strong concern that white Protestant Anglo-Saxon America was under siege, and it was not only directed against foreigners, it was also directed against African Americans. Now, most of this was sparked by a movie, actually, and it was known as The Birth of a Nation. It was directed by D.W. Griffith, and D.W. Griffith's movie was based on a novel known as The Klansman, which was published in 1915 by Thomas Dixon, which offers a racist, white-centric view of the reconstruction of the Deep South. Essentially what this movie does is it depicts noble white Southerners as being made helpless by carpetbaggers who empowered freed slaves to abuse white men and violate women. And ultimately the heroes in this movie were the Ku Klux Klan, who saved the whites, the South, and the nation through their actions. Now, ultimately this film was reviled by the NAACP, but it was celebrated by many whites who accepted this historical revisionism. And in fact, President Woodrow Wilson actually said of the film that it is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true. Now, films like this really pushed through racist and radical ideas during this period. And before we move on from that, here's a picture from the film, a poster advertising the film The Birth of a Nation, which was extremely popular during this period. And films like The Birth of the Nation and other sorts of propaganda during this period really resulted in the resurgence of the KKK, which had been dormant since 1877. And a second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan was established at Stone Mountain, Georgia, under William Simmons during the 1920s. However, the new Klan, as opposed to the Klan which was prominent in the 1870s, really publicly eschewed violence, and as a result, it received mainstream support during this period. Essentially, its main platforms were it wanted to embrace Protestantism in the United States as a reaction to the Catholic immigrants who come into the country. It wanted to embrace stricter immigration policies, And as a result of this and the fear and the nativism, which we already discussed before, it had a strong appeal to numerous Americans, and numerous Americans joined the Ku Klux Klan during this period. Several of these individuals who joined were also women, and the women groups were very active in reform activities during this period, including prohibition and distribution of Bibles at public schools, etc., which we'll talk about more in a minute. And these same women were members of the Ku Klux Klan. However, it would be false to assume that the Ku Klux Klan, in spite of their public pronouncements, did not engage in violence. There were numerous crosses burned during this period. There was a denouncement against Catholics and Jews. And while they publicly abstained from violence, they did employ intimidation, violence, and terrorism in an underground movement, particularly in the South. Now, as I mentioned, it was very popular. In fact, it had 6 million members in the South and the West, particularly the Midwest, which is actually more Americans than were found in all labor unions at the time. So that's very, very significant. Now, its popularity was ultimately short-lived because the states in particular passed anti-masking legislation. There were also a number of public scandals, including the Grand Dragon of Indiana was convicted of murdering a school teacher who was white. And a number of celebrities and other individuals also publicly denounced the Klan, including a man by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a Protestant minister and a conservative intellectual in New York. There were also several Jewish organizations, such as the Anti-Defamation League, which we talked about in a previous lecture, which expressed discontent. And the NAACP also lobbied against it in Congress and ultimately contributed to its demise. However, the point that ultimately resulted in the demise of the KKK, and which we will discuss in the next lecture, was the Great Depression. And the main reason that this resulted in the demise of the KKK is because with the Great Depression, people had less money, they had less dues to pay to the centralized organization, and therefore it kind of fell in. However, small groups of the KKK did continue until the 1950s. Here's a picture of the KKK in 1921 burning a cross, and it's noteworthy that 2 of these members are men and 1 is a woman. Now, another example of backlash against the new world, the world that the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age had created, was really rooted in the rural areas of America, and the fact that when rural people from the countryside came to cities, they really found them sinful and with little regard for biblical values and the teachings of the Bible. Now, this really created a conflict between urban or rural people. People in urban centers viewed the country folk as being behind the times, and people in rural centers viewed the urbanites as being sinful and in need of repentance. And ultimately, this really culminated when Tennessee lawmakers battled over the issue of whether or not evolution should be taught in public schools. And by the 1920s, it's noteworthy that many standard textbooks in the United States contained Darwin's theory of natural selection, and this was taught in numerous public schools during this period. Now, fundamental Protestants really targeted this as symbolic of what was wrong with the Roaring Twenties. And ultimately, this culminated in Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation, and to teach that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Now, ultimately, this created lots of disputes. The American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, hoped to challenge the Butler Act as infringing on freedom of speech. And ultimately this was brought to a head with what was known as the Scopes Monkey trial. Now, William Jennings Bryan, who we talked about in several previous lectures, who ran for President of the United States with the Democratic Party, was in charge of arguing the case for the prosecution, and it's noteworthy that he was very religiously conservative. And in fact, William Jennings Bryan had actually preached in a previous scenario about the spread of secularism and the declining role of religion in education and how bad this was for the public school system. And he was actually known for offering $100 to anyone that he encountered on the street who would be willing to admit that he descended from an ape. Now, for the defense, there was a man by the name of Clarence Darrow, who was a prominent lawyer and an outspoken agnostic. And basically, in his opening statement, he said that the Scopes isn't on trial, but civilization is on trial. No man's belief will be safe if they win. And this really struck chord in society. Now, ultimately, Scopes, who was against allowing the teaching of evolution within schools and prohibiting this within his classroom, was found guilty and he was fined $100. And this resulted in an even stronger divide between Christians and evolutionists during this period. Here's a picture from the Scopes monkey trial. Another instance that really shows the discord that people had with the New World was the rise of evangelical Christianity during this period, and really the rise of the celebrity preacher. A good example of this is Billy Sunday, who was a professional baseball player in a previous time, in a previous life, and he was really a celebrity in America and was known as the nation's most revered evangelist during this period. And it's noteworthy that Sunday had access to very wealthy and powerful families, and he rallied Americans around old-time fundamentalist religion and also support for prohibition during this period. Another example of an evangelical preacher was a woman by the name of Aimee Semple McPherson, who was a Canadian Pentecostal and whose Four Square Church in Los Angeles catered to a very large community of people from the Midwest and newcomers to California. And her message was really the fundamental truths of the Bible. However, it's noteworthy that as opposed to what many people consider to be fundamental truths, she actually was not old-fashioned. She really kind of mixed Hollywood with evangelical Christianity. She dressed in very tight-fitting clothes, she wore makeup, she held radio broadcast services, and she also staged very elaborate faith healing performances. Now, this and Aimee McPherson really typified the contradictions of this decade. And ultimately, revelations of a love affair cost her her status and her following eventually, but she was a very, very popular preacher during this period. On the left side, you have a picture of Billy Sunday, and on the right side, you have a picture of Aimee McPherson. And this brings us to the third part of the lecture, namely people in the 1920s and the types of people and what they did and how they lived. Now, in urban America, many young people embraced a new morality, which was much more permissive than in previous generations and in the generations of their parents and grandparents. The age was known as the Jazz Age, and people during this period listened to jazz, they danced, and they also drank, which was a result of the widespread bootlegging and importing of alcohol which thrived during this period. Now, this new morality was basically rooted in disillusionment, which really evolved during the post-World War I era. And people had numerous reactions to the disillusionment that evolved during this period. Young women, for example, adopted the dress and mannerisms of the flapper, who was a jazz age female stereotype who sought endless parties and a good time. The flapper wore shorter skirts, shorter hair, more makeup, and significantly they also drank and smoked with boys, which was previously not accepted in earlier generations. The male equivalent of this was known as the chic, and the fads of being a flapper or a chic really became a type of conformity during this period, especially among college-age youth. And the signature bob haircut really became universal during this period in both the US and overseas. We'll see a picture of the bob haircut in a minute. Now, it's noteworthy that sexual mores also changed during this period as well, and social customs became more permissive. Petting parties or necking parties became the rage on college campuses. And psychologist Sigmund Freud and others also emphasized that sex was natural and pleasurable during this period, which really encouraged people to engage in this sort of activity. A woman by the name of Margaret Sanger also made it possible for more people to engage in sexual activity, because as the founder of Planned Parenthood, she launched an information campaign on birth control to give women a choice in several aspects of their sexual life. And this also resulted in the popularization of contraception. And it's noteworthy that people took their cues in terms of new morality from the movies, which really were pervasive during this period, as we discussed before, and from the confessions of movie stars, and they really started to emulate movie stars during this period, much in the same way that people emulate movie stars today. Here's a picture of the flapper with the bob haircut. And this really brings us to the new woman. Now, all of this change in terms of the way that people were acting during this period was really part of a larger women's rights movement. And the flaunting of the social and sexual norms by flappers really represented an attempt to match gains in political equality, which came with the 19th Amendment, as we discussed in a previous lecture, to gains in the social sphere. Now, promotion of women also occurred in other ways during this period, and I've given you a few of these examples here. In 1921, there was the Shepard-Towner Act, which earmarked $1.25 million for baby clinics and educational programs, including nursing, which gave women more freedom and time and allowed them to do more things with their life. This also dramatically reduced infant mortality during the period. It was also in 1923, Alice Paul, who we discussed, was part of the Silent Sentinels and really pushed for the 19th Amendment. She drafted and promoted the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which stated that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. So this took it beyond simply voting rights into all spheres of society. However, it's also ironic that progressivism also lost steam during this period. And in fact, many women actually dropped out of the progressive movement after the passage of the 19th Amendment. As a result of this, legislation like the ERA, like Alice Paul's ERA, stalled. And by the end of the 1920s, Congress even allowed funding for the Shepard-Towner Act to lapse. The reason for this is that women were joining the workforce during this period and had less time to be concerned with these sorts of things. However, it's noteworthy that wage inequality really continued throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, this brings us to another aspect of the people during this period. African Americans, like women, also expanded their horizons during the 1920s, and they embraced a new concept, namely that of the new Negro. Now, the decade witnessed the continual migration of African Americans to the North to flee Jim Crow laws, and we've talked about a lot of this in previous lectures. However, when they arrived in the North, as was discussed, they discovered that it was hardly free from discrimination and segregation. Businesses and property owners and employers and even private citizens practiced de facto segregation in the North. However, people during this period really came, or they continue to come, because of 2 points. Schools and the right to vote, which were far more free in the North than the South for African Americans. And in fact, African American and the African American population in New York doubled during this period. Now, the New York neighborhood of Harlem, which is at the north end of Manhattan, became a center for African American art, music, poetry, and politics during this period, and really propagated this new Negro idea. And this movement became known as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was basically a rediscovery of Black culture. And African American artists and writers formulated an independent Black culture during this period and encouraged things like racial pride and rejecting the emulation of white American culture. So whereas people in the previous times, such as Booker T. Washington, advocated that African Americans should try to work to be part of society, the Harlem Renaissance really advocated the complete opposite. Now, there were several noteworthy individuals in the Harlem Renaissance, including Claude McKay, who wrote a poem, If We Must Die, which basically called on African Americans to fight back in the wake of the Red Summer Riots in 1919, which we discussed in the lecture before this. There was Langston Hughes, who basically invoked sacrifice and just cause of civil rights in his book, The Colored Soldier. And as a result of this, Negro nationalism really evolved as well, which proposed that African Americans had a distinct and separate national heritage that should inspire pride and a sense of community within the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois, who we talked about before, also adopted this and promoted this, as well as Pan-Africanism, which really embraced the African continent as the true homeland of all ethnic Africans. Now, a man by the name of Marcus Garvey really took this one step further and promoted the Back to Africa movement, in which he advocated that African Americans should actually return to the African continent. And Garvey founded the Black Star steamship line during this period to help people return. And he also started the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, which attracted thousands of lower income working people during the period. However, it's also noteworthy that he also promoted the doctrine of negritude, which basically reversed what had previously been popular, namely that the white people were at the top of the hierarchy and mixed people were in the middle, and people with less white heritage or less white background were at the bottom. And he basically identified people with darker black skin as being superior to light-skinned black people who were superior to white people. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, who had lighter skin and was therefore lower in Garvey's social order, considered Garvey to be a charlatan, and he really was very outspoken about his view of the disrespect that Garvey was causing in the African American community. However, Garvey, who was eventually imprisoned for mail fraud and then was actually deported to Africa, really set the legacy for people like Malcolm X and the Black Power movement of the 1960s, which we'll discuss at a later point. Now here's a picture of Claude McKay, who, as I mentioned, wrote the poem If We Must Die, which called on African Americans to fight back in the wake of the summer riots of 1919. And this brings us to another group of people during this period, namely the Prohibitionists and the gangsters. Now, Prohibition was legalized in 1919 with the 18th Amendment. However, illegal alcohol began coming from Canada and the Caribbean immediately after this, and rural Americans resorted to moonshine, which was produced within their houses or their barns. The result of this was eventually a eroding respect for law and order in the United States. And in fact, Prohibition, rather than bringing about sobriety, really gave rise to a new subculture of people like illegal importers and interstate smuggling, or bootlegging as it was called, saloons, which were called speakeasies, hip flasks, cocktail parties, and most significantly, organized crime. Moreover, Prohibition also revealed deep political divisions within the nation. And Democrats really struggled in this respect because their base was really split between urban northern wets, as they were called, and rural southern dries. And this really hurt the Democrats politically during this period because of this split within their voter base. And it ultimately resulted in the Republicans gaining ascendancy during the 1920s and basically dominating politics during this period. Moreover, though presidents during this period openly supported prohibition laws, they really failed to give funding to support it, and this resulted in gangsters which evolved, such as Scarface Al Capone, who ran an extensive bootlegging and criminal operation known as the Chicago Outfit or the Chicago Mafia in the 1920s. And by 1927, Al Capone's organization included things like bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and even murder. Now, this enterprise earned Al Capone more than $100 million annually, and many police were on his payroll. And his liquor trafficking business and Chicago soup kitchens during the Great Depression led many to liken him to Robin Hood, because he was actually helping people out through his soup kitchens, and many people thought that what the government was doing by attempting to prohibit the sale of alcohol was not in the best interest of the people. Nevertheless, Al Capone was eventually imprisoned for 11 years for tax evasion, and he even served a stint in Alcatraz during this period. Here's a picture of Al Capone, his mugshot. And this brings us to a last group of people that were prominent during the 1920s, namely what is known as the Lost Generation. Essentially what the Lost Generation was a group of intellectuals who really struggled with disillusionment in the same way that the evangelical Protestants and the other groups suffered with during this period. These groups, this group included people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, Edith Wharton, and others who really expressed their hopelessness and despair by skewering the middle class within their writings and their work. Essentially, this group felt alienated by society, and they tried to escape and criticize it. In fact, many of them escaped to Europe during this period and led an expatriate life in Paris during the 1920s. However, they were also in cities like Rome and Berlin. A prime example of this is F. Scott Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby in 1929, which exposed the doom that always followed the fun, fast life that the 1920s advocated. And it was about a millionaire named Jay Gatsby, who basically lived this sort of life. And it's really ironic that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda also lived this life as well. And they actually squandered all the money that they made from writing The Great Gatsby. Another prime example from the Lost Generation was Ernest Hemingway, who was another disillusioned writer. And he lived in several countries during this period, including several countries in Europe, and he lived in Cuba and Africa as well. And he even worked as an ambulance driver in Italy during the First World War. And he traveled to Spain during the 1930s to cover the Spanish Civil War there as well. So he's very, very well traveled. Now, his best known novella was The Old Man and the Sea, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And he was actually eventually given the Nobel Prize in Literature for this work as well. Here's a picture of Ernest Hemingway. And this brings us to the fourth part of the lecture, namely politics in the 1920s. Now, as mentioned before, the Democrats really lost out in the 1920s because of a variety of factors, including the fact that they had a split voter base and their policies on immigration, which became very unpopular during this period. And the 1920s really signaled the return to a pro-business type of government. In fact, this sentiment is best typified by Calvin Coolidge and his statement that the chief business of the American people is business. And this really became the dominant attitude during this period. Now, in the election of 1920, the professional Republicans were really eager to nominate a man that they could manage and control easily. They did not want a difficult president. And Warren G. Harding, who was a senator from Ohio, was just such a man. He was a very likable individual. He was very genial and affable. He was known for playing golf, drinking alcohol, and playing poker. And he picked as his running mate Calvin Coolidge, who was the governor of Massachusetts, and basically attracted voters based on the promise of a return to normalcy, which we discussed briefly in the last lecture. Now, as mentioned in the last lecture as well, Harding won dominantly during this election. He gained 61% of the popular vote. And as mentioned, this is really the decade of business. And his appointment of his cabinet really reflected his pro-business agenda. He appointed Herbert Hoover, who was a millionaire engineer and miner, as his Secretary of Commerce, for example. And Harding was very successful during this period in promoting partnerships between the government and businesses, and he did a very, very good job of this. In fact, he thought that the government should be run like a business, and he appointed people that viewed this the same way. Now, in terms of foreign policy, he really worked to preserve peace through international cooperation and arms reductions worldwide. He was very against war and military conflict, especially in the wake of the First World War. And he actually worked with Germany and Austria to secure a formal peace, despite the non-ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. However, despite this, the Harding administration really has gone down in history as ridden with scandal. And even though Harding himself was personally honest, he typically surrounded himself with politicians who weren't, which really put a black stain on his presidency. For example, from 1920 to 1923, his Secretary of the Interior, whose name was Albert B. Fall, was involved in what was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Essentially, what happened within this scandal is that Fall leased Navy reserves in Teapot Dome, which is a city in Wyoming, and also two other sites in California to private oil companies with no open bidding processes. So he basically did not allow any other companies to gain rights to these particular pieces of land. And the companies gave him $300,000 in cash and bonds, plus a herd of cattle for his ranch to get rights to these particular sites to dig for oil. Now, ultimately, Fall was convicted of accepting bribes, and he was fined as well, and he was actually sentenced to 1 year in prison. Ultimately, as a result of this, Harding's presidency ended before his term was up, and the final nail in the coffin of his presidency was the fact that he suffered a heart attack in July of 1923. And a little bit later than this, because of the stress that he'd endured as a result of all of these scandals, he suffered a stroke and died in San Francisco. As a result of his death, his presidency was left to his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. And it's noteworthy that even in spite of Harding's scandals, few presidents were so deeply mourned by the public as Harding, because he really endeared himself to them as a normal guy that you could hang out with and relate to. Now, Calvin Coolidge was completely the opposite. And as it says here, he was a man of few words. And he had a very strong belief in the Puritan work ethic, which was essentially that you should work hard and save your money, and keep your mouth shut, and listen, and all good things will happen to you. So he had a completely different philosophy than Harding, who was a drinker, hung out with people who played poker, etc. And his nickname was Silent Cal. Now, the first terms of Silent Cal were devoted to eliminating the scandals that Harding had brought to the White House. And he also followed the fiscal policies of Harding in many respects, particularly one of Harding's advisors, Andrew Mellon. And he became the first president in the White House to make a profit, which is very noteworthy. He also believed that the rich were worthy of their property and that poverty was the wage of sin, so he was very pro-business in that respect. And he also believed that the government should let businessmen handle their own affairs with as little intervention as possible. And this would be something that would also typify Coolidge's successor, Herbert Hoover, and would ultimately be his downfall as well. Now, silence and inactivity were really the dominant features of Coolidge's presidency, and the 1924 election saw Coolidge win easily over the Democrats, who fought over their nomination and had a split voter base and had the same problems that were discussed before. Now, this is the last slide of this lecture, namely about the election of 1928. And it's noteworthy that Coolidge announced that he wouldn't run again for the 1928 election, and he announced this a year earlier in 1927. As a result, the Republicans nominated the Secretary of Commerce, namely Herbert Hoover, as their appointee, and the Democrats nominated Alfred E. Smith of New York. Now, Smith represented everything small town and everything that small town and rural America hated. He was Irish, he was Catholic, he was anti-prohibition, and he was also big city, and this hurt Alfred E. Smith's nomination severely. And as a result, Hoover won very easily. And at the beginning of Hoover's presidency, the stock market continued to rise. Prosperity was really the catchword in America. And many Americans who hadn't done so previously also started investing in the stock market and believing that prosperous times would come for them. However, less than a year later, the bubble would burst and a harsh reality would take place in America, namely the Great Depression, which will be the topic of the next lecture.